The Ivy Inn. Elena approached the table where her latest customers had taken a seat. During winters, the traffic in the area became peculiar. While there were fewer travelers out and about, those who did venture out made it a point to stop at every inn they could find, if only to warm up for a while. At the Ivy Inn, the waves of occupancy were entirely unpredictable during the winter months. Tired travelers from all walks of life, from the humblest poor fellows and farmers to hedge knights and the occasional lowly knight, sought refuge within its welcoming walls. The nobles, however, usually preferred to visit keeps and estates rather than inns. As Elena approached the table, she observed the three men lowering the hoods of their travelers' cloaks. To her surprise, their appearance was rather striking. Despite their well-worn cloaks, they all looked surprisingly clean, and at least two of them had striking features, high chins and chiseled jaws. One of them, in particular, had a mesmerizing blend of blue and green eyes that caught her attention. The two noble-looking men had lustrous brown hair, with the one possessing striking eyes having a shade slightly darker than his companions. In contrast, the last member of the group boasted a mop of dirty blonde hair that complemented his glinting brown eyes. Despite being obviously the youngest of the three, he was not much younger than Elena, who was 10 and 8. All three of them were younger than her. "Welcome, sirs. My name is Elena, and I am the innkeeper," she said with a welcoming smile, taking a moment to nod to each of them before continuing. "What can I help you with today?" The man with the mesmerizing blend of blue and green eyes returned her smile graciously. "I am afraid we are in no way anointed, and may the gods strike us down if we were to pretend otherwise," he explained smoothly, causing her eyes to widen in surprise. It was evident from his refined manner of speaking that he was no ordinary traveler. Only knights and nobles talked like that, and if they weren't knights. "My apologies, my lords." It is not often that Elena began, but the man with the captivating eyes raised his hand, signaling for her to stop. "And neither are we lords," Christopher Mudd clarified, nodding toward his two companions who seemed content to let him take the lead. "My name is Christopher Mudd," he introduced himself with a courteous demeanor. Gesturing to his right at the other brown-haired man, he continued, "This is Adam Waters." Finally, he pointed to the companion with dirty blonde hair, stating, "And this is Robin of Sow's Horn." She couldn't help but deflate, thoroughly confused by the curious trio. "Then what are you? Sellswords? Merchants?" she inquired, trying to make sense of their enigmatic presence at her inn. The trio chuckled warmly before Christopher replied, a glint of mystery in his eyes. "Let us just call ourselves travelers and leave it at that," he said, evading a direct answer. Elena couldn't help but press further, intrigued by their peculiar demeanor. "But you have a family name. Only nobles and sellswords possess those, and you are not nearly crude enough to be a sellsword," she remarked with genuine curiosity. Christopher raised a curious eyebrow, intrigued by her insight. "And you know a lot about sellswords?" he inquired, genuinely interested. After all, sellswords typically sought their fortunes in distant lands like Essos during times of peace in the Seven Kingdoms. She reddened slightly, realizing she had only met one sellsword before, and he had indeed been crude enough to leave a lasting impression. If her father had still been with them at that time, she was sure he would have chased the man halfway across Westeros for merely speaking to her. But those days were now memories, and she quickly composed herself as a cough interrupted her reminiscing thoughts. Her cheeks flamed up, embarrassed by the brief lapse in her composure, and she met three amused faces. Determined not to let her emotions get the better of her, she swiftly regained her poise. "What can I get you, travelers?" she quickly interjected before they could comment on her momentary distraction. Christopher stayed silent for a moment before gesturing to his companions. They quickly ordered a couple of beers and whatever they were serving for the day. "And I would like the same as my companions, but I was wondering if you knew of any opportunities in the area for three healthy fellows such as ourselves to get some work, and also if you had any rooms for us as well," Christopher suddenly asked. "Well, I do have a couple of rooms available," Elena replied, contemplating the situation. "As for work, I suppose I could use your help with a few tasks around here," she added, considering their capabilities. And if there's nothing specific you'd like to assist with, you could always inquire with some of my patrons if they are in need of anything, she suggested after a moment of thought, trying to find a suitable way for them to contribute or make themselves useful during their stay. Christopher nodded attentively. Well, what do you need done? Eleanor didn't need to think for long. There is quite a lot of snow on the roof, and while it is a sturdy building, I wouldn't want to risk it, she explained, concerned about the weight of the snow possibly causing damage to the inn. Christopher looked over to his companions, and they both shrugged in agreement. Well, let us eat for a bit, and then we can talk about the pay, he suggested, understanding the need to fuel themselves before taking on any tasks. Eleanor blushed slightly, reminding herself that these men were, after all, her customers. It wouldn't be appropriate to interrupt them while they ate. Of course, just call me over once you are ready, she managed to say politely before retreating to the kitchen to get their order. The rest of the day passed in relative calm, with familiar faces among the regular patrons and a few scepters stopping by on their way to Maidenpool. This was the most interesting occurrence before Robin, the youngest of her newly employed workers, poked his head inside the front door. All done, madam, he said, offering a wide grin as he delivered the news of his completed tasks. Eleanor rolled her eyes good-naturedly at the formal title, nodding in acknowledgement before replying that she would be right out. She made sure to inform Doria, her skilled cook, that she could handle any customer inquiries in her absence. Then, she donned a warm coat and stepped out into the ankle-deep snow. The crisp winter air embraced her as she ventured outside, her breath forming little clouds in front of her face. The sun had already started its descent, casting a warm golden hue over the snowy landscape. Eleanor made her way to the side of the inn, where Robin and his companions had been working diligently to clear the snow from the roof. Eleanor scanned the area, still unable to spot the other two companions. "And where would your?" she began to inquire, but her words trailed off when Christopher suddenly made his way down the roof from the other side. Eleanor. It's a good thing we settled on pay at completion instead of hourly, or we would have been up there all night for a few more silver stags, Christopher shouted down to her, a playful twinkle in his eyes. She put on a mock-angry face. "You would defraud a humble innkeeper such as myself. Where is your honor, sir?" she retorted, though her smile betrayed her amusement. Christopher simply grinned in response. "Oh, come now, you weren't so innocent when we haggled a couple of hours ago if I recall correctly," he teased. "What say you, Robin?" Robin, from beside her, joined in, his eyes gleaming mischievously. "Certainly not. Eleanor is a very stern haggler, I tell you. We had to put up a good fight for our fair share." "A little bit of friendly negotiation never hurt anyone," she replied, her amusement evident in her tone, before chuckling and sending a grateful smile to both Christopher and Robin. "In any case, you all did a splendid job, and I'm truly grateful for your hard work." As she scanned the surroundings, looking around for Adam, she raised an eyebrow in an unsaid question. Christopher quickly picked up on her curiosity and chimed in, "Adam is currently taking care of our baggage and horse. We thought we'd handle the last part of the job ourselves, you know, to take all the glory and all that," he finished with a playful wink. Eleanor laughed, genuinely appreciating their good-natured banter. "I will spare an ale for him when he shows up then," she playfully declared. Robin raised an eyebrow, his expression playful. "Oh, I don't recall ordering another one," he said, glancing over at Christopher, who shook his head in agreement. Eleanor raised her arms in a placating gesture, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "Well, I thought that after swindling you out of all that money with my haggling, the least I could do for you is to give you a victory ale on the house," she said with a sly grin. Christopher chuckled, thoroughly amused by her response. "Well, in that case, we'll happily accept your generous offer," he said with a grin, effortlessly descending from the roof. As he landed in the snow, he sank slightly but managed to maintain his balance with practiced ease. "Ooh, let's hurry inside. I don't have the right boots to stand here in the snow for long," he declared, setting off toward the entrance. Eleanor laughed, following Christopher's lead as they made their way back to the inviting warmth of the inn. The fire crackled merrily in the hearth, and the air was filled with the comforting scent of hearty meals. At the table where they had been sitting earlier, Elinor spotted Adam, who seemed surprisingly cheery despite his usual reserved expression. Or perhaps it was simply the fatigue of travel that had softened his demeanor. After all, she had only met the three of them today. She found herself somewhat surprised at how quickly she had grown accustomed to their little group dynamic. As she observed Adam from across the room, Elinor couldn't shake the feeling that these were indeed trustworthy men. Throughout their admittedly brief stay at the inn, they had conducted themselves with an air of authenticity and sincerity, giving her no reason to doubt their intentions. Elinor, though relatively new to running the inn, understood that welcoming strangers was an integral part of her business. She had taken over the inn from her father 2 years ago, and while she had grown into the role, she couldn't help but miss his wisdom and intuition. He possessed a remarkable ability to discern his customers' moods, even those who appeared reserved or guarded. It was a skill she greatly admired and had hoped to learn from him, but now he was gone. It was as simple as that, and she had long realized that life sometimes took unexpected turns. As she saw the trio reunite, sharing small jokes and playful banter, Elinor couldn't help but simply watch them for a few moments. There was a peculiar paradox that came with running an inn. She interacted with so many people daily, engaging in conversations, and offering a listening ear. Yet, amidst the sea of faces, many interactions were fleeting, superficial, or driven by personal agendas. People sought solace and camaraderie at the inn, and she didn't fault them for it. After all, it was often a place to escape from the burdens of daily life. They came to drown their sorrows in ale or mead, to find fleeting comfort in the company of strangers, or to share their tales of woe with a sympathetic ear. However, as Elinor leaned against the polished wood of the bar, observing the trio, she couldn't deny the underlying loneliness that sometimes accompanied her role as an innkeeper. She talked with so many, yet deep connections were rare. It was as if she stood at the center of a swirling vortex of lives, but somehow, she remained detached, a mere observer rather than an active participant. In the midst of laughter and camaraderie, she often felt like a silent presence, a facilitator of stories but not the protagonist in her own. She knew it was the nature of her profession, and she had accepted it with grace, but that didn't make the moments of solitude any less poignant. She took a deep breath, pushing away the pangs of longing that occasionally surfaced. She had chosen this life, and she cherished the beauty of the inn, the warm ambience, and the sense of community it provided. She loved the opportunity to create a haven for travelers, offering them respite from the outside world. Christopher's gaze held a captivating intensity that surprised Elinor, momentarily pulling her into a world of intrigue and curiosity. His inviting smile and the way he gestured for her to join him was both charming and disarming. For a brief moment, she hesitated, her eyes briefly glancing over at Doria, who seemed to have everything under control with the current customers. Doria's vigilant presence and watchful eye on the inn reassured Elinor that she could spare a moment to sit down and join the conversation. Besides, she didn't necessarily need to drink anything, she simply enjoyed the company. Taking a seat beside Christopher, Elinor felt drawn to his enigmatic presence. As their eyes briefly met, she quickly averted her gaze, feeling a flutter of nerves. But his kind smile and attentive nature put her at ease. He was far from poor company, that was certain. The night was certainly no dry affair, and after a while, Elinor couldn't resist indulging in a mug or two of ale herself. Doria, her capable assistant, seemed to have no trouble running the inn in her absence. Elinor admired Doria's diligence and orderliness. She was a reliable and pleasant presence, always ensuring everything ran smoothly. As the night wore on, the atmosphere in the inn became livelier, and with it came the occasional grumble from a patron about the change they received. However, Doria handled these situations with skill and tact. She would dutifully count the money, even though it was always correct, to diffuse any tension that might arise when patrons, under the influence of alcohol, became a bit self-conscious about their finances. Elinor appreciated Doria's ability to maintain order and harmony, creating a welcoming environment for all guests. It allowed her to enjoy the night, savoring the camaraderie and laughter that filled the inn. As Elinor retreated to her chambers after a couple of hours of camaraderie with Christopher and the others, she looked up at the familiar wooden wall and frowned. Wait, where was her cozy little fireplace? Confused, she turned around and accidentally bumped into something on the bed. Her head snapped to the side, and she found herself face to face with Christopher. Oh my! He seemed to wake up at her gaze, and she wasn't sure if she had made any noise. It had been over a year since she had been in such a situation, especially after the sellsword. He had been quite charming as well. But Christopher was different. He exuded a certain charm and respect that set him apart. "Good morning," Christopher greeted her, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. She blinked, slightly flustered before laying back on her back. "Disappointing?" he asked, playfully. Quickly, she replied, "No, not disappointing at all." As she remembered the events of the previous night, she blushed slightly but acknowledged that the experience was different from what she had known before. She wasn't particularly experienced, but she had now had 3 encounters, and each one was unique and incomparable. Despite her initial surprise, she realized that she wasn't disappointed with this new connection either. "Well, I am always hungry after exercise," Elinor remarked, looking over at Christopher with a raised eyebrow. He quickly threw up his arms in surrender, playfully admitting, "That was uncalled for, my lady, disgraceful to my family name." She simply snorted, finding his humor endearing. "So, how old are you? You don't simply have a young face?" she inquired, hoping he was around her age. Christopher shook his head, revealing 6 and 10. Elinor groaned, realizing that he was younger than she had hoped. "Doria will never let me hear the end of this," she muttered, knowing her assistant would tease her relentlessly about her romantic involvement with a younger man. Christopher chuckled and then gestured toward one of the walls. "Well, the last I saw of her, she was on her way into the neighboring room. Adam is no older than me." Her eyes widened in surprise. "And who is taking care of the inn?" she asked, concerned about the state of her business. Christopher simply shrugged, seeming untroubled by the matter. Elinor couldn't help but jump out of his bed at that moment, only to be greeted by the cool air that hit her most intimate parts. She quickly grabbed a blanket, wrapping it tightly around herself, and then began locating her small clothes and dress scattered about the place. Christopher attempted to make light of the situation. "Nothing I haven't seen," he began with a teasing grin. She shot him a half-irritated look. "Don't you dare say it," she interrupted him, finishing getting dressed in haste. Before she rushed toward the door, she stuck her head back into the room. "This was nice, but I have an end to run. I hope you understand," she said genuinely before disappearing, leaving behind a mirthful very from Christopher. As Elinor resumed her duties at the Ivy Inn, her mind couldn't help but drift back to the unexpected encounter with Christopher. It had been undeniably nice, and she found herself smiling at the memory. But she couldn't ignore the questions swirling in her mind. Did this encounter change anything between them? Would it have any lasting impact? And what about the future? Christopher was just passing through, he wouldn't stay forever. What would happen then? As she served bowls of warm porridge to a couple of early risers, she sighed, realizing that some things were beyond her control. She had built a life around running the inn and tending to her guests. Christopher's presence had stirred something within her, but she had responsibilities to uphold. She knew that the inn was an unchangeable part of her life, a place she had poured her heart and soul into. Nothing, not even a charming fellow like Christopher, could alter that. As much as she enjoyed their connection, she also understood the transient nature of their encounter. He was a traveler passing through, and she had a responsibility to tend to the inn and its guests. Elinor couldn't help but think about her father and how he would have reacted to her unexpected encounter with Christopher. He had dedicated his life to building and running the Ivy Inn, and she knew he would have been furious if she had ever considered abandoning it for a man, no matter how charming or intriguing. "How was Lady Lyra, Tris?" Robin asked mischievously as they sat at their customary table. The last moon had been a joy. There had been no repeat performances between Elena and Christopher, at least not yet. She had noticed the occasional lingering glances he gave her. Nevertheless, she valued the genuine friendship that had developed between her and the traveling trio. It had been a delightful surprise to find such a strong connection with them. They had not traveled particularly far, just from Sow's Horn, right off the King's Road, a couple of leagues away, a 2-day walk at most. It was a lot closer than she had imagined when they had stumbled into the inn on that early winter morning. She had imagined the Stormlands or something, but apparently not. Elena also knew that they still possessed some secrets, like why Christopher was called Mud and the identity of Adam's lineage. While the fact that he came from Sow's Horn narrowed it down, it wasn't a sure thing regardless. "Don't call me Triss," Christopher growled out, thoroughly annoyed. It had taken some time, but they had eventually found something that got under his skin. Well, she had, but she didn't dare use it. Adam and Robin, however, had no such inhibitions, though Christopher's death glare might change their minds. Elena couldn't help but giggle at the name, and when his gaze shifted over to her, she quickly coughed to cover it up. "And who was this Lady Lyra?" she asked, trying to play it off as if that was the reason for her amusement. He didn't look entirely convinced, but eventually, he shook his head. Elena gained a playful smirk. "Another one of your conquests?" Adam spits out his drink, and Robin burst into laughter. Christopher, meanwhile, only gained a smart smirk that Adam quickly noticed. "You wouldn't," the bastard exclaimed in horror. There was obviously a story there, but Elena decided not to dig. They were leaving tomorrow, after all. Now was not the time to ask about sensitive matters. Christopher seemed to embrace the tension as he hummed non-committedly. When Adam looked ready to scream in frustration at his friend's coy behavior, he finally answered with a shake of his head. "No, though not without admirable self-control, I have to admit. All right, I do not need to hear that. She may only be my stepsister, but I wouldn't let you touch my great-grand-uncle's distant cousin's grandchild. You muds are slippery fellows, I tell you, slithering into your life with a charming smile and 100 bad ideas just out of sight." "Hey, I would say I have quite good ideas actually. What do you think, Robin? Wasn't this a good idea?" Christopher gestured around the inn before throwing an arm around her waist. It wasn't often that they hadn't sat beside each other, that was true. There had almost become a permanent seating arrangement with her and Christopher on one bench and Robin and Adam opposite, respectively. This didn't stop her blush, and she quickly scanned the closest tables. There weren't many patrons so late, and the ones that were occupied didn't seem terribly interested in their conversation. When she looked over at the bar and saw Doria, she quickly averted her eyes once the mischievous minx winked at her. When she looked back at her friends, she saw Robin rolling his eyes with a small smile at the display, while Adam looked dismissive. "Doria is a lot more enthusiastic. You've only done it once, besides." Christopher simply smirked while adopting a lecturing tone. "Patience is a virtue, young Adam." "That was horrible, Triss. How many should I expect in your room tomorrow morning?" Adam teased with a playful grin. Christopher didn't answer as Adam vacated, but when Robin, who followed Adam, turned around before disappearing upstairs, Christopher stuck up 2 fingers jokingly. Robin only shook his head before vanishing upstairs. "Terribly sure of yourself, Sir Mud," she said jokingly, meeting his eyes with a playful smile. "Well, when you have such a beautiful woman, it's hard to let that slip by their fingers," he replied, complimenting her. She blushed at his words, feeling a mix of bashfulness and flattery. She knew she could be considered pretty with her flowing brown hair, dark hazel eyes, and womanly figure even seen through her conservative gown. She blinked and shook her head, trying to regain her composure. "Stop distracting me, flattery will get you everywhere," he finished with a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Christopher, this is the last chance we have for a real conversation," she eventually managed to say. He sat a little straighter, nodding in acknowledgement. "Very well, what did you want to talk about?" She hesitated, taken aback by his instant sincerity. It was surprising, though maybe not entirely. Christopher had always possessed a peculiar way of effortlessly switching between light-heartedness and seriousness, like now, where he could turn completely serious within the blink of an eye. If he was acting, she thought, he would have to be one of the best mamas she had ever seen, but that notion didn't sit well with her. Christopher was many things, but a mama was not something she could envision him as. "Well, what happens now? You will not stay," Elena eventually finished, her words laden with a mix of sadness and resignation. Christopher's nod in response did not surprise her. "No, I am leaving tomorrow, and we all knew that this day would come. Not exactly when, but it seems like the jobs in the area are getting fewer and farther between, and we need to move on. We are not here for pleasure, after all," he explained calmly. Her heart was in turmoil, and she struggled to find the right words. "So you will just find a new in?" "A new?" He immediately shook his head. "No, this was not something to occupy me with, if that's what you're thinking. This was no simple act of lust, but it was nothing permanent, and I hope you know that as well." He paused. "It was, as they say, not meant to be." She closed her eyes, the weight of the moment settling in as she awaited Christopher's response. "Can you at least tell me where you are going, and why?" she asked, her voice tinged with both curiosity and a hint of sadness. She opened her eyes, searching his face for any clues. Christopher appeared lost in thought for a moment, his gaze distant. "I will be attending a tourney in a couple of moons," he finally replied, breaking the silence. "And for that, we need some coins." "So what exactly are you?" "I don't believe a simple group of travelers would participate in a tourney," she asked with a hint of humor. He seemed to appreciate it as he sent her a small smile. "The name Mud isn't something I invented, it is my family name," he explained, his expression growing distant. "We were once kings of the Riverlands before and during the Andal invasion, and that ended when my namesake, Christopher IV the Hammer of Justice, lost his 100th battle after 99 victories." She looked at him dubiously, but he simply shrugged his shoulders. "Take it as you will, but he at least lost his last battle and died in it, and his son Christopher V was granted the moniker the Last, so you can imagine what happened next. We faded into obscurity, and our own family members began doubting or simply didn't care. It was, at best, a couple of millennia ago," he clarified, noticing her confused look. "Thousands of years." She blinked, and he nodded. "It is a long time, and many might wonder why bother at all," he acknowledged. She didn't want to visibly agree, but she had that very thought herself. Plenty of lowborn were related to prominent families, and those family connections did not help if the food got too scarce or the weather too cold. In the end, they were as dead as any other man. Christopher's voice held a mix of determination and vulnerability as he shared his ambitious dream. "Maybe it is a foolish dream of a young boy," he began, "but I hope to rebuild my house. I have a grandfather who devoted his entire life to this endeavor. And I can't fault him. Why settle for less when one can do so much more? Or at least try to do so much more." His words hung in the air, and Elena could feel the weight of his aspirations. It was evident that his dream was no fleeting fancy but a deeply rooted desire to restore his family's once proud legacy. The sense of duty and responsibility he felt toward his ancestors resonated with her, and she admired his commitment to honoring their past. At that moment, Christopher seemed to be seeking her approval, perhaps hoping that she would understand and support his vision. She met his gaze with a reassuring smile, her eyes reflecting her genuine interest in his dream. "I guess you are right. What do you lose by doing this?" Christopher pondered for a moment, his expression was thoughtful yet uncertain. "And that is proof, if you cannot think of anything to lose by pursuing your dream, then you didn't have much to lose anyway," Elena concluded with a reassuring smile. They were silent for a moment before Christopher shook his head and stood up. "Let us retire to our chambers," he said with a hint of mock formality. She couldn't help but laugh as he took her hand and led her towards the stairs. "Oh, well, lead the way, my king," she teased playfully. She gave him a mock glare as they ascended the stairs. "It seems you have this all planned out," she remarked, feigning offense. He grinned mischievously. Well, how could I not when I had no fun for a moon? Is it fun you call it? She teased in return as they reached his room. With a mischievous glint in his eyes, he responded, Oh, and what would you call it? He didn't give her a chance to answer as he dragged her inside the room, and they both disappeared behind the door. Lord Went's great tournament. Adam strode purposefully through the disorderly collection of tents, his expression revealing a mixture of concern and frustration. 3 affluent young men, surrounded by a haphazard crew of opportunistic bandits posing as guards, could never bode well. Christopher, for some inexplicable reason, seemed unfazed. His gaze lingered distrustfully on the smattering of bandits around him, their ragged attire and rusty equipment marring the camp. Even though they hadn't faced an attack yet, Adam feared that, if it came to pass, these men would prove less than reliable. Beside Adam walked his brother in all but blood, Robin. Since their departure from Sow's Horn, Robin had shed some of his usual joking manner, a change quite understandable given the circumstances of their exit. But that was a year ago now, and while he had thankfully lost his somberness after their stay at the Ivy Inn, he still had something in his eyes, they still hadn't regained their glint. Regardless, Robin was as loyal as ever to both Christopher and Adam. Their brotherly bonds had never been stronger. Approaching Christopher's tent, Adam cast a watchful eye over the surrounding outlaws. Christopher's undisclosed promises had prompted Adam to seek out more reliable individuals, ones who seemed promising. His recent recruits engaged in a game of dice nearby, strategically keeping their weapons within reach, setting them apart from the more dubious outlaws. As he passed, they nodded respectfully, a gesture he reciprocated. The 5 recruits consisted of Harden and Jeremy, recruited from Maidenpool, and Kennett, Myrn, and Raymond, recruited from Saltpans. All of them, except for Harden, hailed from different towns and villages along the Riverlands, forming a diverse group. Harden, on the other hand, originated from White Harbor, adding a northern touch to the mix. Raymond claimed the title of the oldest member among the recruits at 21. The rest, including Christopher and Adam at 17, fell within a similar age range, all driven by a shared eagerness to make something of their lives for one reason or another. Their group now included 2 horses, a sturdy cart, 20 outlaws, and 6 recruits, including the original 3, making a total of 28 men. Adam couldn't shake off the thought of the party's unusual size for a supposed group of traders. As they approached Harrenhal, a mere day's march away, he couldn't help but worry about how Christopher would explain this motley crew to the lords. It was highly unlikely that a gathering of common folk would be welcomed at their grand tourney. They wouldn't be posing as traders either, and Christopher intended to exploit his heritage as far as he could, but a caravan guard in itself would be bad enough, but then the fact that they were remnants of the recently defeated Kingswood Brotherhood. Adam just hoped Christopher knew what he was doing. They arrived in front of the tent, and Adam led the way through the opening. He was greeted with the sight of Christopher hunched over a small table that they had been taking with them since Maidenpool. Adam, Christopher greeted, lifting his head from the open book before him. Cracking his neck from an undoubtedly uncomfortable reading posture, the handsome man acknowledged Robin with a nod. "We have work to do," Christopher announced as he rose from his seat. Walking over to a small desk with 4 chairs, Christopher gestured for them to join him. The 3 young men sat down, awaiting Christopher's explanation. Folding his hands, the scion of House Mudd sighed. "I am not unaware of certain tensions in our little party, and these brigands would be a recognizable and unwanted addition to the Dragon Prince's grand tournament." Adam felt relieved. For some time, he had genuinely worried that Christopher might be deluded enough to keep the bandits. He was grateful to be proven wrong. "And how are we to ensure their separation? You promised them quite a reward for helping us these last weeks," Adam inquired. He hadn't heard anything, but a mutiny of sorts definitely wasn't impossible with brigands of questionable loyalty. Especially if they felt betrayed. Adam looked over at Robin. He could see his foster brother gain at the glint in his eyes. Christopher pondered for a moment. "Well, I do have a plan for that. We are outnumbered, but they lack discipline and caution, he surmised. They need to die, Robin suddenly proclaimed. Adam looked at the younger man in shock, only heightening when Christopher nodded with a small smile. For Adam, at least, not so much the suggestion as the person proclaiming it, it seemed that Robin had changed more than he had thought. Robin had been more reserved, but Adam shook himself from his thoughts. The bandit problem took priority. Indeed, we can bear rumors if they pop up, but evidence of me harboring former Kingswood bandits would surely catch the attention of the king or someone equally disastrous, which would end with our heads being lined prettily along the Traitor's Walk. Christopher paused for a moment before adding, or a pile of ashes, as the king is wont to do, according to rumors. Adam tried to rationalize and slowly saw the truth of it. I agree. However, associating with that rabble in the first place was a foolish decision, he said. The whole situation left a bad taste in his mouth. Christopher shrugged. Gullible idiots who know which side to hold a sword with a salary of hopes and dreams are not easy to find, and they were a good way to discourage other idiots on our travels. Robin finally spoke again. Very well, how do you intend to do this, then? Christopher simply smiled before beginning his explanation. Christopher, adorned in his well-crafted armor, stood shoulder to shoulder with the three other officers. Adam assumed his position on Christopher's right, while Robin positioned himself on their leader's left. Though their attire was limited to chainmail, it was meticulously maintained, setting them apart from the bandits clad in weathered leathers. Adam maintained a composed demeanor as he surveyed the gathering of soldiers, a mix of loyal recruits and Brotherhood bandits. His satisfaction stemmed from the well-equipped state of his recruits, while the bandits presented a varied picture in terms of attire and alertness. Recognizing the potential for resistance, the idea of openly eliminating the bandits was swiftly dismissed. They had discussed it earlier and deemed it too risky. Outlaws, even shoddy as these, still possessed some skill in their arms, and they did outnumber them. Christopher energetically raised his hands. My friends, our journey through the Riverlands has led us to a pivotal moment. A buzz of excitement reverberated among the bandits. A city of tents lies just a day's travel away, where the wealthiest men and women in these lands have gathered for the grandest festivities seen in decades. Adam, maintaining composure, observed as Christopher echoed the carefully prepared speech from earlier. It might have seemed bold, but they all agreed that to catch the bandits off guard, they had to align with the Kingswood Brotherhood's anti-Lord narrative. It was a daring move, but these desperate brigands would surely take the bait. Christopher continued talking down the corrupt tyrannical lords and how they were going to be remembered for all of eternity for leaving the greatest lords looking like beggars. It was quite over the top in Adam's opinion, but these were not the brightest men, and ale soon began to flow. Robin handed Christopher a goblet which he raised, toasting their changed fortunes. Christopher set down the water-filled goblet and eased into a more relaxed posture. The ensuing hours unfolded with the men filling the air with boisterous songs and engaging in lively dances around the twin campfires of their little encampment. Adam kept a sharp eye on his recruits and was pleased to see them limiting their alcohol. Long after the sun had disappeared and with the moon placed centrally overlooking them, Christopher raised his goblet once more, though this time the few bandits that remained were so deep in their cups that there wasn't even a reaction. Christopher nodded and drew his blade out of its scabbard slowly, followed by the officers and recruits. The ones moaning around the campfires were soon dispatched with a hand over the mouth and swords to the necks, painting the dirt below red and dark. Adam felt no pleasure as he repeated the motion on two more. It was going flawlessly. The bandits only meters away remained unaware even as men were killed right beside them. The campfires were soon cleared and the tents followed. The whole sordid business was concluded within half an hour or so, and at the end, he simply felt drained. Christopher gathered the group, eyeing the bodies scattered around them. Before the first light, stack them up and gather their weapons. Take an ear from each man, the Mud directed the 5 recruits, who nodded in silent agreement. Each of you will receive 10 dragons as compensation and a token of appreciation for your loyalty and discretion before we set off tomorrow. Christopher fixed his gaze on each recruit individually, dismissing them with a casual wave. While the recruits weren't exactly overjoyed, it was clear they had no qualms about the recent events. The extra reward served as a fitting recognition of their service. Without hesitation, they began the grim task at hand. Christopher turned to Adam. Quietly inform Lord Went that we've located and dealt with a small Kingswood remnant. His men are welcome to confirm our claims if the severed ears don't suffice. Adam barely had time to nod before Christopher shifted his attention to their youngest companion. Robin, gather the weapons. Load them onto the cart before we depart, it'd be a shame to leave them here to rust. Christopher pivoted on his heel and made his way toward his tent. He paused for a moment, calling over his shoulder, leave their tents be. Pack only our equipment and anything that can be traced back to us. With that, Christopher disappeared into his tent. Are you satisfied? Adam suddenly asked Robin, his tone bordering on accusatory, though he wasn't entirely certain who or what he was frustrated with. The dirty blonde youth locked eyes with him before nodding. It was a choice between us or them, Adam. But they've proven useful. Robin gazed into the crackling fire. We were attacked 3 times from Southhorn to the Ivy Inn, a week-long journey. Since the bandits joined us, we haven't faced a single threat in 3 weeks. We've been able to trade and profit without fear and minimal expenses, given their non-existent salaries. Adam found no fault. Indeed, they had enjoyed an undisturbed journey, with his main concern revolving around the bandits, a worry now laid to rest. I agree with you, but this, he gestured towards Harden and Raymond carrying a body devoid of its ear. Robin interrupted him before he could elaborate further. Was necessary, they would have surely killed us, either before reaching Harrenhal or once they sensed our vulnerability. The only reason they hadn't so far was due to the absence of a leader, and they felt secure resting for a while. Robin gestured towards one of the corpses. I know he saw himself as the leader, stirring up support in the shadows, a shrewd man, if only he had chosen better company. Adam gazed at the lifeless body, its neck and tunic stained with dried blood. The cold, dead eyes seemed to stare unfeelingly up at the night sky. Good night, Adam. Let's get some rest before tomorrow, it's bound to be a significant day, Robin remarked before retreating to his tent. Adam soon followed suit, surrendering to the night chill as he crawled into his sleeping bag, hoping this had been worth it. Sir Titus Blackwood let out an exasperated huff as his youngest brother, Jamus, playfully tapped him on the shoulder. Are you even aware that you're a knight now? Titus asked, a mix of irritation and amusement evident in his tone. Meanwhile, Jamus seemed entirely disinterested, not bothering to meet Titus' gaze. Ignoring his brother's antics, Titus followed Jamus' line of sight to the seasoned warrior in gleaming white armor leading a procession of men. That's Sir Barristan Selmy, Jamus exclaimed. As the 2 brothers observed, they noticed 2 more Kingsguard knights trailing behind Sir Barristan, the legendary Sword of the Morning and Sir Oswell Went. In the forefront, 2 banner-bearers flanked the Dragon Prince, resplendent in dragon-themed black armor with a red cloak flowing over his shoulders and back. A regal horse-drawn carriage rolled alongside, presumably carrying the princess. Titus simply hummed in response to his little brother's exclamation. The Crown Prince Rhaegar, known for his studious nature in his younger years, had evidently not neglected his martial education. With Sir Gerald Hightower, Sir Barristan Selmy, and the esteemed Sir Arthur Dane as mentors and companions, proficiency was almost inevitable, he imagined. An impressive man for his age, though with a large shadow to escape, remarked a voice from behind the Blackwood brothers. Titus spun around to find his liege lord standing there. Bowing his head respectfully to the Tully, a man twice his age of 21, though the lord's healthy mane of auburn hair showed no signs of aging. Barely a name-day older than me, Titus mentioned, and Lord Hoster nodded. Indeed, though his eyes seemed to have seen a lot more, Sir Titus, the Blackwood heir agreed. The purple-eyed prince's gaze was dark and concentrated, sweeping over the assembled crowd of nobles, knights, and small folk. Despite his polite smile, his eyes bore a more serious demeanor. Sir Jamus, my congratulations on your knighthood. Sir Geoffrey is a competent knight, and I am sure he makes a fine teacher. His brother, Lord Jason, certainly doesn't lack proficiency when he leaves Seaguard for a tourney, the Lord Paramount suddenly remarked to his hitherto silent brother. The younger man nodded quickly, a slight blush colouring his cheeks. Thank you, my lord. Sir Geoffrey was delighted with our skirmish against some bandits around Hag's Mire, and he granted me a knighthood, even though I only squired for 2 years, Sir Jamus said proudly. 1 and 6 is an impressive age to be knighted. I'm sure you will continue to impress, Lord Hoster praised good-naturedly before turning back to Titos with a more serious look. How fares Lord Bryndon? I hear he is bedridden? Titos sighed at the mention of his lord father. He never fully recovered from the War of the Ninepenny Kings. Each day, he appears more fatigued, and some part of me fears he won't survive until our return to Raventree. He knew that his father had served under Lord Hoster during the war, and he figured the man would appreciate a more detailed account than he would usually admit about private family matters. Lord Hoster nodded wearily. Your father's a good man, and I only hope he will get to depart painlessly whenever the stranger calls him. Both Titos and Jamus nodded respectfully. I believe we will take our leave now. My other siblings have probably gotten themselves into some trouble already. I am sure we will meet at the feast tonight, my lord, Titos said politely. Lord Hoster nodded with a smile. And congratulations on the new son as well. I hope Lady Moya is well? As well as can be, my lord, and thank you again, Titos replied before departing, with Jamus following him. They weaved their way through the vast crowd toward the sea of tents visible over the heads of the assembled people. Looking to his left, Titos saw Harrenhal's Kingspire Tower stretching into the sky, the top part bearing the scars of melted stone from the Targaryens' dragonfire. It was where Black Harren and his sons had hidden until their last moments. Further down, an arching bridge connected it to the higher levels of the Widow's Tower. That his ancestors had played a role in constructing the impressive feat of engineering left him with a bittersweet feeling, especially considering the circumstances. A many times great-grandfather of his had faced execution for treason due to his refusal to contribute to Black Harrenhal's construction. This decision had not only impoverished his family but had also affected almost every other Riverlord and many Ironborn lords over the 4-decade construction period. Titos let his gaze fall once again and was pleased to notice that they had entered the sea of tents. Banners fluttered all around, Crownlanders, Valamen, Westerlanders, Reachmen, Stormlanders. Rosby, Hayford, Redfort, Hunter, Lydon, and dozens more passed his eyes as they walked, displayed on banners as well as surcoats and decorating tents. He had never witnessed so many lords and nobles gathered in one place, and the Dornish and Northmen hadn't even arrived yet. His eyes suddenly focused on an initially unassuming brown tabard that Titos was ready to ignore if not for the sigil, a golden crown adorned by green emeralds. Most wouldn't likely recognize the royal mud arms after so many centuries since they allegedly disappeared, but the extensive libraries at Raventree Hall, coupled with Oldstone's relative proximity, had always kindled his interest in the legendary and fellow First Men house. The tales of the Hammer of Justice and Artos the Strong had always fascinated him, along with the tragedy of Christopher the Last, of course. Raising his gaze to the handsome youth donning the brown tabard, he was met with a striking blend of green and blue eyes beneath short brown hair. The man was accompanied by a slightly bigger figure clad in chainmail, with brown hair a shade lighter than the mud's and tawny brown eyes. Tugging his brother along, Titos walked over to the mud and his companion, or guard. "Apologies, sir?" Titos began as he neared the younger man. Christopher Mudd turned to face him slowly. "Only Christopher Mudd, sirs, Blackwood," the man replied after a moment, glancing briefly at Titos's brother. He possessed a surprisingly mature voice, around the age of Jamus but more seasoned. "Sir Titos Blackwood, and this is my brother, Sir Jamus," Titos introduced before casting Christopher an intrigued look. "I must confess that House Mudd was the last house I would have imagined at this tourney," said Christopher. The sudden appearance of an extinct house was highly unusual, and Tytos would have been extremely skeptical if a member of House Strong or Coharis had made an unexpected entrance. However, an ancient house like House Mud? It would be an odd choice for impersonation, and its sigil was not something one stumbled upon in most lords' libraries. "I am no knight, Sir Tytos," the Mud corrected him, shaking his head before Tytos could apologize. "It matters not. I thought it was high time for my house to re-emerge after our extended absence. My homeland has called me, and I answered," Christopher said with an easy smile. Yet, like Prince Rhaegar, his eyes seemed to betray a seriousness that transcended his casual demeanor. "I believe we will have much to discuss. How about you join us for a meal now so we aren't half-starved at the feast?" Christopher looked a little surprised at the suggestion before turning to his companion. Tytos could feel his brother's gaze burning into his side as he simply waited for the two men to finish their silent communication. Christopher finally turned back. "If my friend, Sir Adam, could join us, then I would gladly accept." Tytos was slightly surprised at the man beside the Mud being knighted, considering the man's chainmail, but saw no issues with it. "Certainly. Do you have anything else, or can we leave for our tent immediately?" The Mud shook his head. "I am afraid that I plan to sign up for the melee, but we can join you afterward," the young man said inquisitively. "Very well. Our families were great allies in the past. We even have personal memoirs of a few of the Mud Kings, not the Hammer of Justice, unfortunately, but his son and a few older, now long forgotten ones," Tytos admitted. They were in bad condition, but it was fascinating to read what could be deciphered. The Mud's eyes finally brightened with obvious interest. Before, they had been guarded and cautious, but now there was an obvious hunger, one could say. "Memoirs? My grandfather has been desperate to patch together what remains of knowledge of our house, and it has only been from Maester's years after Christopher the Last and of questionable bias. To have first-hand accounts," Christopher mumbled the last part, but Tytos still picked up on it. Tytos wasn't sure why he believed the man's story so readily. Perhaps it was a massive error, and he was being foolish, but the sheer happiness in the Mud's eyes only solidified his assumption that this was fate in a way. The Blackwoods were now the only first-man house south of the Neck, and he felt they were only becoming more and more isolated with each passing year. They had friends in the Mallisters and some other Andal houses, but that was because they seemed to ignore their first-man heritage altogether. The marriage of King Aegon V and Betha Blackwood had been a boon for their house and still felt to this day. The Brackens, their greatest rivals, seemed to be kept around only to try to drag House Blackwood down to the Seven Hells with them. The current head of House Bracken, Lord Jonas Bracken, was a farce of a human being, let alone a knight. Only his name made Tytos' cold fury rise. He was thankful that Lord Went had had the peace of mind to separate and place the two houses on either side of the encampment. Hopefully, they would gain a new ally in the region if Christopher managed to secure himself a noble marriage. Tytos had an unmarried younger sister, but a marriage was premature. However, he harbored the hope that there would once again be a union between House Mud and House Blackwood in a generation or two. Tytos, however, believed that aiding his fellow First Men in gaining a foothold would ultimately fortify the Blackwoods' position. While he held honor in high regard and considered assisting the fallen house a righteous cause, his pragmatic side recognized the value of having a friendly neighbor, one bound to stay amicable, if only out of gratitude for Tytos' intended support. "I'm certain you'll find them to your liking, Christopher. Can I expect you within the hour?" Tytos finally inquired. "Of course, Sir Tytos," Christopher responded with a genuine expression, a hint of respect in his gaze. "Tytos will do. If you lack a knight's title, then I shall forego mine in our conversations," he declared, leading his brother away from Christopher and his knight with a sense of finality. The feast roared on, a lively spectacle, as Christopher found himself seated beside the Blackwoods. Their prominent positions beneath the royal dais owed much to Tytos' insistence. The Hall of 100 Hearths, though cavernous, brimmed with the largest gathering since the Great Council of 101 AC. Lords and knights crowded closest to the royal dais, filling benches and tables that extended into the distance. Christopher's entire entourage occupied a more distant section, leaving him amidst unfamiliar faces, with the exception of the Blackwoods. Their earlier meal, despite being their first meeting, proved surprisingly pleasant. Jamus, brimming with energy and a mere name-day younger than Christopher, eagerly proposed a sparring match after the meal. His recent knighthood, granted only weeks before the tournament by Sir Geoffrey Mallister at the age of 16 name days, showcased an impressive achievement. In spite of Jamus' accomplishment, Christopher maintained confidence in his own abilities. Sir Robert Hogg, though lacking in certain areas, demonstrated remarkable proficiency in martial matters, as did his master-at-arms. This solid foundation became evident as Christopher found satisfaction in decisively winning their bout. Despite Jamus being above average in swordplay, Christopher struck the younger man 5 times, meeting their goal, while only enduring one hit, a conciliatory one from Jamus as Christopher momentarily slipped up. The Blackwood exhibited an impressive series of strikes that eventually breached Christopher's guard. Tyto's other brother, Sir Edwin, proved far more reserved. While he joined Tytos in observing Christopher and Jamus sparring, he refrained from commenting and only offered a polite farewell when Christopher departed. The sole Blackwood girl, Alisanne, presented a striking figure with her raven-black hair framing a lovely face. Standing taller than most girls her age, she reached a height that allowed her to meet Christopher's eyes, despite him being 2 years her senior. The Blackwoods collectively possessed the trait of being tall and lithe, with Alisanne, at 5 and 10, likely having attained her full height. Her demeanor exuded courtesy and politeness, reflecting the reserved nature of her older brother Edwin. Tytos remained courteous and friendly, maintaining his reputation as an honorable and chivalrous man. Despite receiving knighthood in the faith of the Seven, he held steadfast beliefs in the old gods, a seeming contradiction to some, but one that appeared not to bother Tytos. Christopher didn't perceive the Blackwood heir as naive. Instead, he found himself speculating on possible motives behind the noble's amiable attitude toward him and his apparent goal to help restore House Mudd or, at the very least, build some bonds. Christopher could entertain the idea of a historical alliance between the two houses in the distant past, but that seemed far-fetched as the sole reason for Tytos's friendliness. Perhaps the real incentive lay in the fact that it would put Christopher and his family in a personal debt to the Blackwoods. As things stood, if Christopher had his way, they would be neighbors. Despite being unable to discern any obvious ploys, Christopher decided to accept the Riverlord's assistance, acknowledging that any eventual obligations would have to be handled appropriately if they arose. Sir Tytos. A strong voice suddenly resonated from behind them, causing both Christopher and Tytos to turn in surprise at the sudden noise. A tall and handsome man with brown hair and a trimmed beard stood behind them, wearing a wide smile and holding a tankard in his hand. The direwolf sigil on his grey-white doublet revealed to Christopher who he was looking at. "Brandon, it's good to see you. I haven't laid eyes on you since yours and Lady Caitlyn's betrothal feast. How many years has it been now?" Tytos inquired after standing and shaking the Stark's hand. Brandon Stark's grey eyes narrowed in thought. "Oh, 4 or 5 years ago now. Has it really been that long?" he mumbled before turning to Christopher. "Never mind that. Who is your young friend here?" Christopher joined Tytos in standing as the Blackwood introduced him. "This, my friend, is Christopher Mudd. I must admit that I only met him earlier today, but he has proved proficient with a sword, and his family name caught my interest." Brandon and Christopher shook hands firmly as the Stark intensely held his gaze. This continued for a moment or two before the heir of Winterfell's face broke out into a smile. "Good with the sword, eh? New opponents are always exciting. Do you plan to participate in any of the events?" "I have signed up for the melee, Lord Brandon." The Stark's surprisingly expressive grey eyes, considering the Northmen's cold reputation, lit up at his words, making Christopher feel slightly nervous. Laughing, Brandon gripped Christopher's shoulder. "Well then, we will see each other's capabilities there, and call me Brandon." Brandon's attention then shifted to the other part of Christopher's introduction. "And what is this about your family? I must confess that House Mud doesn't ring any bells in my northern mind, the Stark heir admitted with an obviously curious look. House Mud ruled the Riverlands as kings from Old Stones once upon a time, but after the Andal invasion, they were scarcely mentioned in any history book. It is curious to see one appear after such a long time, Tytos eventually explained. Brandon looked intently at the Blackwood before his eyes lit up once again, though this time in recognition. "Ah, the family of the Hammer of Justice?" Brandon proclaimed in a strong voice at the lengthy title. With Christopher's nod, the Stark continued, "Indeed, the first man-king who won 99 out of 100 battles. I still remember some of my lessons, you see, though my brother Ned could probably tell you more," Brandon said in a proud voice as his gaze swept around them. "Ah, there he is!" Brandon finally exclaimed, looking at a brown-haired young man surrounded by another with a similar appearance, a brunette, and a massive black-haired man. Turning back to the two, he gestured with the tankard. "Come, join me. I don't believe either of you have met my brother Ned or Benjen, and you, Christopher, haven't had the pleasure of my sister Lyanna." Tytos snorted at the last remark, and Brandon cracked a smile as the Blackwood quickly turned behind them. Christopher followed his gaze over to the distracted Blackwoods. Jamis was in conversation with a purple and silver-clad knight a few name days older than Tytos, whom Christopher had learned was Sir Geoffrey Mallister, the man that the Blackwood youth had squired under. Sir Edwin and Alisan were engaged in a quiet conversation. Turning back to Brandon, they both nodded. As they walked, both Brandon and Tytos greeted Riverlords and Northmen as they passed. Christopher looked up to the dais where Prince Rhaegar and Lord Went sat side by side. Spread around were Princess Elia, Lady Went, Lord Went's 4 sons, and sole daughter. As they neared the Stark siblings, Christopher soon deduced the identity of the black-haired man. The crowned stag on the Lord's doublet was obvious as they approached. Robert Baratheon, being the only one facing them in the group, was the first to notice their approach. Sir Tytos, the young Lord of Storm's End, greeted in a booming voice. The other Starks turned and nodded as Christopher and the 2 others sat down next to Lord Robert. Tytos ended up next to the young Lord Paramount, with Brandon in the middle and Christopher on the far side, opposite Lady Lyanna. Lord Rickard's only daughter, to Christopher's shock, looked bored out of her mind as her dark grey eyes passed disinterestedly from Lord Robert over to Tytos. They brightened when they passed Brandon and lost interest again as they landed on him. She was a pretty woman, he supposed, with long brown hair and a long face showing the family connection to her brothers. She was no delicate beauty like Princess Elia but held her own charm. He was unsure of how he was supposed to react, having never experienced a noble lady being so apathetic. He was soon brought out of his thoughts as he heard his name being called. "So, this is Christopher Mudd, he will participate in the melee." Brandon introduced him to his siblings and the Baratheon. Eddard seemed to be the only one who recognized his family name, though he didn't say anything. Neither Benjen nor Robert seemed to know of it, and the Baratheon simply sent him a lazy smile. "I will look for you in the melee, you look like you could put up a good fight," the Lord of the Stormlands said bluntly. This seemed to be relatively high praise, especially from such an imposing man. Though if it was genuine remained to be seen. Before Christopher could reply, the hall hushed to mere whispers, and the minstrels and bards fell silent. More and more heads turned toward the entrance, where 2 massive doors were placed to the side between the dais at one end of the hall and the start of the tables closest to the dais. The doors were open, revealing the white-armored figures of 2 Kingsguard knights. Between them stood a thin and gaunt figure. The man's white hair was unkempt, obviously not washed for some time. A long, equally unkempt beard hung from his face, and his fingernails, closer to claws, visibly protruded from his hands. Upon the frail frame of the Targaryen, an expensive-looking black robe adorned with a red 3-headed dragon appeared dirty. The golden crown, with dragons rising from it, was the only element that prevented Christopher from dismissing the man as a beggar who had dragged himself from the dirtiest puddle in Flea Bottom. The unmistakable King Aerys II stumbled through the doors toward the dais. Christopher had heard rumors from King's Landing, of course, but had dismissed most as completely outlandish. The monarch's appearance, however, seemed to have been understated from what Christopher now witnessed. He was aware of the king's kidnapping during the defiance of Duskendale, and the subsequent rescue left King Aerys forever changed. However, to think that this was the legacy of the infamous Targaryen dynasty was hard to believe. The evidence, though, was right in front of him, as the monarch struggled up the few stairs leading to the dais. The entire high table was on their feet, each wearing expressions of shock. While Lord Went's daughter openly displayed poorly disguised disgust, both the prince and princess exhibited fear. Although they quickly concealed their emotions behind neutral expressions, Christopher had keenly observed the initial reactions. "Such a grand gathering," croaked the voice of whatever entity was posing as King Aerys. It shouldn't have carried over the massive hall, but the absolute silence allowed the voice to reach every corner. "It was a shame that my heir forgot to invite his liege. A simple mistake, I am sure," the king added with a dangerous undertone, slipping past his son and settling into the lord's chair. There was utter silence as the king began noisily eating from Prince Rhaegar's plate, disregarding the gold-decorated cutlery and opting for his hands. It created the most tense atmosphere Christopher had ever experienced. After a few drawn-out moments, the high table slowly returned to their seats, each behaving as if an apex predator were in their midst. Prince Rhaegar now sat apart from Lord Walter Went, separated by the hunched form of his father. Unbeknownst to Christopher, he had risen from his seat. As he descended back onto the bench, a single thought echoed persistently in his mind: how could this creature be the Lord of the Seven Kingdoms?